Hello, and thank you for joining us here at the First Alert Desk. I'm Maria Moreau. We are talking about a weekend of violent crime that we saw here in Metro Atlanta. A few stories that have been making headlines that we're going to get into. But first, I want to bring in Ted Golden. He is a former law enforcement analyst and Memphis police officer and former DEA agent, a man of many titles here joining us. But I brought you on to talk a little bit about some of what we're seeing, especially over the weekend. You know, we heard about an array of crimes, some of the most violent that we typically see here in Atlanta. And I stopped for a moment and thought, you know, this is such an important time to talk about the officers and investigators that respond to these situations and navigating crime here in a big city like Atlanta. So, Ted Golden, thank you so much for joining us here today. Let's start by talking about your background. You have been immersed in law enforcement for quite a long time. You have a very impressive resume. I was hoping you could share with our viewers what a law enforcement analyst does.
Well, really, the difficult part about everything is having to see these things that go on and being able to look at what goes on and try to discern how to best approach an investigation. Having been a DEA agent for 28 years, it's real inclusive that people understand that we have a hard job because you got to be working with all cylinders wide open, and it takes a lot of time and energy to develop a knack for how you approach investigations in a way that end up with a positive result.
And, you know, for an analyst like you have been, or you were for such a long time, it's an important role to take a moment and talk strategy and how investigators go about situations that impact real people. You talk about real victims, real suspects, the real world. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these stories that came in from over the weekend, starting with this one out of Forsyth County. A former teacher arrested for alleged child sex crimes. I'm going to get into this story a little bit. This was a teacher by the name of James Andrew Cecil of Cumming, and he was a teacher at Pools Mill Elementary School. Now, he was arrested just this past Friday on charges of possession of child pornography and sexual exploitation of children. That arrest actually stemmed from a tip that was made to the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office Internet Crimes Against Children's Unit. So a very important unit, very a niche unit that focuses on this specific type of crime. And that's what brings me into this conversation with you as we talk about many tips for officers and investigators that come from community members and lead to these types of arrests of individuals that many parents trust to guard their children during several hours of their day. Let's talk a little bit about investigators that are involved in crimes like these, where children are involved, where it's often within the community in the most sensitive parts of the community.
Well, you know, sexual predators are embedded in our society. They've been here for a long time. And they've gotten good at concealing themselves because of technology. They use the computers to get on the dark web and communicate with their compadres and what they're doing. And they do a lot of bad things to a lot of very young children. And it's unfortunate because the sharing of information that they do, the videos, the pictures, the things that they order these children to do on video, and the effort that they make to try to make sure that they are not detected. They sit in all walks of life, not even in law enforcement. We have people that have been caught in these matters, but realistically, very young children are always susceptible. And the difficult part for law enforcement is having to sit down with a child very young and to ask those critical questions. I had an encounter with a situation in Memphis once where a 10-year-old was abused. And because I had a rookie officer with me, he had to do the report. And he was asking questions, and he just broke down. He said, "I can't do this. I don't see how you do it. I just can't do it." So I let him slide that time, and I went ahead and took the initial report. But it's hard not to take it personal, especially when you're a parent, especially of daughters, because more times than not, it's a female child that's being abused.
And I'm glad you brought that up, you know, this being such an emotional crime, so many more victims than just the victim that is put on paper. Take me through the world of the investigator that has to navigate this challenge, as you mentioned, with having to conduct an investigation, have to be fair to evidence, and also, keep in mind that this is a child, a young person, still their whole life ahead of them, dealing with a situation that they're too young to really understand.
Well, the hard part is that many times these children have been abused so many times, it's normal. And it's what they do because they think it's okay, especially very young children, as young as 5 and 4 years old. So what happens is it becomes part of their persona. I even had an instance where a grandmother awakened to find her 4-year-old granddaughter performing oral sex on her 5-year-old nephew. And it was a devastating thing for her to discover. But at the same time, her mother was a prostitute and her daddy was a pimp/drug dealer. So you can't not realize where it comes from. So when you start researching backgrounds and gathering information, it's a big discovery, but you have to go through that process. And like I always say, you work backwards. You start from the incident that happened, and you go backwards to try to figure out where this came from, where it initially started, and who are the people involved.
When we talk about these specific units that specialize, this one particularly in internet crimes against children, how can, or what are some common misconceptions from the public when we talk about units like these that are specific to these types of victims? What are some things that most people don't really think about or understand?
Well, the difficulty is that they don't realize how enormous it is. This is a very enormous and very pervasive crime because technology allows them to hide, and it also allows them to be difficult to find because you got to get IP addresses and all those things. And then, of course, because they're using the dark web, you've got to get in there, and then there's so much and it's overwhelming. And because of the fact that you're using technology, you sometimes don't know where they are. Many times, the sharing of information is how you catch up with them. You get one guy, and you're able to pull information off his computer, and that'll help you to be able to trace the other folk that they're in contact with. So it's usually once you catch one, you catch a bunch because they're connected together, and they're using the same kind of browser or whatever they're using to browse the dark web, and the sharing of information. There's usually the technical stuff that's shared when they go to another system or they receive information allows it to be traced. And that also is very cumbersome because you have to have a technical knowledge to be able to understand how to backtrack and locate these folks. So the good part is that law enforcement has gotten smart, and they're able to network themselves when they hold conferences and meetings and stuff, and they're able to reach out to different parts of the country. Many times they're able to catch these things in action, not just with children, but even with adults, because it is so pervasive. It's in our society at every level, whether it's a $500 room at a hotel here in Atlanta to the cheapest $20 an hour shabby hotel on the side of the road. They're able to track that information, and usually, sometimes they set up as an undercover sting, and they're able to use folks who have girls or boys who have a shy voice, and they're able to communicate with them, and they're able to use the technology to run them down and put them in jail.
And such important technology. We talk about, these types of crimes becoming all too common, and with the age of the internet, law enforcement needing to take advanced steps to match that. I want to get into this other story, one that oftentimes we hear about, has a lot of people wondering where the truth lies, and those tend to be the officer-involved shootings. I want to talk about this one that happened early Sunday morning in downtown Atlanta. Now, the Atlanta Police Department requested the assistance of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to come in, conduct an independent investigation after a man was shot by one of their officers. Now, to give some background for those that didn't hear the initial story that we did cover over the weekend here on Atlanta News First, this all stemmed from an incident at the Greyhound bus station, that one you're looking at right now, that on Forsyth Street. Now, that is where security guards were attempting to escort what they described as a disorderly man, that man refusing to clear the area, and the guards eventually asking two uniformed Atlanta police officers at the scene for help. Now, during that encounter, there was an altercation where police told us that the man pulled a handgun and shot at the officers, one of the officers returning fire, fatally shooting that man. So let's talk about that for a moment, because those themselves are sensitive situations. You talk about the expectation of law enforcement to react quickly in the interest of public safety, but also to do it strategically to prevent the loss of unnecessary loss of life. Let's talk about this particular situation with the added help of Atlanta Police Department and their response.
Well, usually cops are stationed down there. They're doing overtime details, so they're at least accessible. Bus stations have always been a place for high crime. Even when I was a Memphis cop back in the day, things happen quickly, and you have to make quick decisions. Anytime a gun is produced, the likelihood is somebody's going to get shot, whether it's a bad guy, the cop, and even sometimes bystanders. You have to weigh the circumstances with the situation and whether or not it is safe to discharge a firearm. But once a person starts shooting at you as a police officer, you have to put your life first, and whatever's around him, the consequences may be dire. Collateral damage or collateral injuries may occur, but the goal then is to take out the perpetrator. You got to take him down, because when he starts shooting, he doesn't care who he shoots, who he hits. He's just trying to, render himself of the situation. And unfortunately, he was firing his weapon, and thank God one of the cops was able to return fire and take him down.
Is it pretty typical for, in these situations, talk about a shooting involving an officer, for them to call in an independent investigation from the GBI?
Now it's standard operating procedure. Almost every local law enforcement agency now, when there's a police-involved shooting, they call in the GBI to conduct an independent investigation, because we're not trustworthy nowadays. They want an independent organization to come in to look at it, to verify it. Back in the day, there was a shoot team. So when a police officer fired his gun, usually it was a team of folk from the police department and also from the district attorney's office that would show up to conduct the investigation. But now, because of the way things are in this country, the distrust of law enforcement to police themselves, an independent agency usually comes in and gets engaged in the investigation from jump, so that there's no question about the credibility of the result of the investigation.
And I know you're not involved in this specific investigation, but we talk about the GBI conducting an independent investigation of the matter. I imagine Atlanta Police still conducting their normal investigation of the situation. How do those two differ?
Well, like I said, unfortunately, most police departments have to give way to the state agency to come in and conduct the investigation. And that way there's no question of what occurred. Now, they may do some independent stuff to verify. They still have to take statements from the police officers. They still have to take the gun and run it through forensics. All those things have to occur. But much of the responsibility is tasked with the state agency. And it's a very demanding responsibility, because we're not just talking about here locally. They respond all over the state now. And it's a bit of a cumbersome situation, because when this thing happens, it gets in line with every other shooting that happened across the state, and it may take them anywhere from 3 to 6 months to have a result, just like the situation at Cop City. It takes time for the information to be examined and for a determination to be made about how it might have occurred and whether or not the officers were involved in what we quote-unquote call a good shoot.
And what is a good shoot, if you don't mind elaborating on that?
Well, most of the time when an officer's in fear of his life or in fear for the life of other people, and then, of course, you have to have the determination based on training and experience whether or not to utilize a firearm was necessary. In most instances, and I'll be honest with you, you're better off pulling your gun than you are waiting. My number 3 son asked me a question one time. He said, "Dad, if someone had a gun and was pointing at you, what would you do?" I said, "Hide. Find a car, a fire plug, or a tree." "You wouldn't draw your gun?" I said, "This is not OK Corral. It's a whole different ball of wax." So we're better off pulling our guns sooner than later, because then at least you can respond when the situation occurs that someone has possession of a firearm. The other thing is, make sure we understand this. We're trained first to honor life. You only pull that gun and shoot it when it's absolutely necessary. There have been occasions in my career where I could have shot someone. And I was able to maneuver myself in a way and maneuver them in a way to let them know that, look, this is not a joke. We're going to drop you. And in one instance, I actually told the guy, you're going to die. And I was behind him. He didn't know I was behind him. He put the gun down and laid down, and he went to jail. And afterwards, he said, thank you. Because when could I have shot him? I could have shot him as soon as I saw the gun, because he was actually pointing it at an undercover agent, not knowing that we were behind him. So, those situations occur. And in other situations, sometimes there's crossfires. You can't shoot. I had a crossfire once many years ago. Had a shotgun. Female officer screamed, because you get tunnel vision when you get in those situations. And she was right behind the guy I was getting ready to shoot. So I had to put the shotgun down, lay down, and let somebody else take care of the business. But the guy was fatally wounded. And unfortunately, because I was the only one who didn't shoot, I had to ride with him in the ambulance. So those are experiences that you take with you. And unfortunately, sometimes it occupies your mind more than it should. Even those instances where you don't shoot and you could have, they still bother you. And especially in those instances where someone does lose their life, regardless of whether it's a perpetrator or a law enforcement officer. I've been to a lot of funerals, and it's unfortunate, but it's what it comes with the turf. Unfortunately, sometimes people get killed, and we have to mourn them, but also keep doing our jobs.
And that is a hard world to navigate for sure. We talk about investigations like these. This man who was fatally shot by officers described as disorderly. What is involved, or if you could share the perspective of what goes into de-escalation, training and de-escalation techniques carried out in the real world for police when you talk about dealing in a public setting with somebody who is disorderly or mentally ill. What does de-escalation look like?
Well, it depends on the circumstances. You don't want de-escalation to be utilized in a way that might cause the officer to be harmed or someone else to be harmed. Usually you can tell if someone is unstable, like domestic violence situations. The goal is to separate people if you can and try to calm them down, and also be conscious of what their movements are. The first thing most cops do when they come on the scene where things are not going well is they make sure they can see the hands of the person, especially the one who's the aggressor. They make sure that they can contain or control their movement and their access. If they've got bags or whatever, they make sure they put those things down. And they want to, let me see your hands. Okay, let's walk over here and have a conversation. And a calm, monotone voice is usually used to get them in a position to where they can at least know that you're there to listen to them, you understand their feelings, and that you want to take it in consideration as you try to resolve the situation. It's a difficult circumstance to separate from, but unfortunately, officers have to make a quick decision. The de-escalation stuff goes to the back burner because lives are at risk, and then that's when they have to take action. But more times than not, these days, we're seeing more police officers using de-escalation training, and it helps them to be able to understand. And by the way, I'm also a trainer at the King Center, so we teach nonviolence, and that's one of the things that one of the ways that we try to help law enforcement. We actually did training with the DeKalb County police officers back at the DeKalb County Schools Police about a year and a half ago. We talked about nonviolence and how to cope with situations and how you can deal with folks who are stressful.
We're speaking with Ted Golden. He is a former, retired, I should say, law enforcement analyst, a former Memphis police officer and D agent, a long list of involvement in the law enforcement community. I want to get into this last story here, and one that is quite honestly all too common. I feel like every day we hear something of this type of story, a shooting at a gas station. This one from over the weekend, turning into a homicide investigation after a man was killed at the Shell gas station on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard and Jimmy Carter Boulevard. Now, investigators say initial evidence does suggest that an altercation at the gas pumps resulted in a shootout that left the victim deceased. That is a story that isn't unique. We hear very often about Atlanta having an issue with violence at gas stations. Why is that?
Well, let's call a spade a spade. The fact that this governor signed a bill that allows anybody to carry a weapon is the biggest culprit here. You used to have to have a permit to carry a firearm, but now you don't. And as a result, everybody's toting a pistol. I was in a shoe store. The guy had the gun hanging out of his pants pocket. Uh, no effort to try to conceal it or anything. So it's okay corral out here. If you get mad enough at somebody, they tick you off. They're pulling guns and shooting each other. It doesn't matter where it is. And unfortunately, a gas station is where it frequently happens. As a matter of fact, there was one about a week or so ago where a young man was standing in the gas station line, and a guy stole his gun from him that was in his pocket, and he ran away from the guy, followed him, and he ended up getting killed by his own gun. So the rules and regulations have changed. We don't know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and unfortunately, because of the fact that everybody can tote a gun, people aren't. It's just not safe anywhere. And the part that bothers me the most is that most of our law enforcement heads, the sheriffs and police chiefs, really didn't come out and say what they should have said. This is going to make law enforcement's job harder. Because when you come on the scene and folks are shooting at each other, and you tell them to drop their guns, I think it was a couple of months ago it happened. Two guys were shooting each other. Cops say drop their guns. One guy dropped a gun, the other one didn't. They killed him because they don't know who the aggressor is. All they know is y'all got guns. So now when you talk about access to weapons, 18 years old, walking around with a gun, get pissed off at somebody, you can shoot them, and there's really no consequence because stand your ground is going to apply. They're just going to claim stand your ground. So it's not a good situation. It's not going to get any better. You're going to see more and more of these things happen because people are gun happy and trigger happy rather, and they rather shoot first and ask questions later.
It's interesting you point out the conceal carry a law that has allowed carrying without the need of a permit, but Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens saying that crime has gone down since the time he stepped into office, which was similar along the lines of the timeline that permitless carry became a thing. So we're starting to hear from the city that crime is going down, and yet we're seeing a weekend of shooting events. How do you navigate that?
Well, data is always easy to manipulate and explain. It depends on the population of people that you're serving and what part of town you're in. If you're in a place where crime is high, and unfortunately you're gonna see more of these incidents. The population of people that you're serving actually determines what the crime rate is going to be. The more educated the population, the lower the crime. The higher the style of living, the lower the crime. So we can look at data and we can say this and that, but to be honest with you, it doesn't matter to the person who's getting shot. They're not concerned about whether the statistics are going down. That my neighbor, who's a fireman at the time, got shot at Stonecrest Mall. This guy thought he was looking at his girlfriend, and he shot the car up. So again, it depends on whose perspective you look at. It's easy to look at data and make a determination, but when you're on the other end of that bullet and you're trying to figure out, okay, why is this guy doing this to me? It's a whole different world.
And, as we talk about these types of stories, this isn't going to be the last we hear of shooting events and violent crime in Atlanta. And we're so grateful for the men and women that do serve and protect this community. I want to end with you on this. How can the ordinary person here in Atlanta who just wants to feel like their family and themselves, they're protected each and every day, what can they do to help keep the community safe?
It's funny you would ask that question. My wife came home yesterday, or day before yesterday, and she saw what she thought was human trafficking. She saw an older Hispanic lady pushing around what appeared to be a young teenage girl who was disheveled, poorly dressed, and clearly in distress. She said, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but by the time they get there, they'll be gone. Mm-hmm. I said, well, the first thing to do is pull your phone out and take pictures. If you know what car they're in, take pictures of the license plate. Especially so that you got something that you can utilize to put a bolo out on so that folks can start looking for this situation. A photograph of the person and the victim will also help, but don't put yourself in jeopardy. We live in a society, unfortunately, where, and this is something that they said to me in college 40 years ago, crime is the price we pay for freedom. We're not a police state. We're in the United States of America where people are free to do what they want most of the time, and unfortunately carrying a gun is one of them. So the best thing you can do is always be aware of your surroundings. Make sure that you know what the unwritten rules are. especially if you're in a place where you know bad things happen frequently. And even in instances where you have to dial 911 with the need for more 911 operators, it's going to be slow. It's going to be a slow response. And unfortunately, with our police officers being overworked, many times if it's not something happening immediately, they're not going to come right away. So use that cell phone to the best of your ability. You take pictures or write down dates, times, and places. And by all means, do not try to intervene yourself, because that too can wind up with you being injured. So it's always best to just sit back and look. And sometimes it doesn't hurt. I'm a retired law enforcement officer. I know things. I see things differently than other people. As an example, 2 days ago, I'm riding down the street around the corner from my house, and I see two teenagers riding on golf carts. We don't have a golf cart path in our neighborhood. Clearly, they've gotten them from someplace else, and they're trying to abscond with them, and they don't drive fast enough, so they got to pull over to the side and let folks pass them because traffic was backing up. I called 911, and the operator goes, "Well, where are they now?" I said, "I don't know. I passed them going in the other direction, but I can tell you where they were headed." Just report what you can, and hopefully law enforcement can get there quickly enough to render the situation safe.
Ted Golden, thank you so much for joining us on here. We're going to be taking you now to our newscast starting at 3 o'clock with some of these latest headlines and more stories of just different things happening around the community. So make sure you tune in. News at 3 is on now. We're going to be taking you through the afternoon into the evening hours with your latest Metro Atlanta stories. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.